the desolate expanse. In the farthest reaches of the world, where the sun barely grazes the horizon and the wind howls like a mournful spirit, there lies a desolate expanse that seems to have been forgotten by time itself. The landscape is a tapestry of jagged rocks and gnarled trees, their twisted forms whispering secrets of ancient horrors. Here the air is thick with an unsettling stillness, a silence that seems to press against the ears as if the very fabric of reality is holding its breath. This is the realm of the Forbidden Mountain, a colossal mass of stone that rises from the earth like a monolithic sentinel, its peak shrouded in an eternal mist that dances with the shadows of the night. As the sun sets, casting long shadows that stretch across the barren ground, the mountain looms larger, its dark silhouette a stark contrast against the fading light. The villagers who dwell in the nearby hamlets speak of it in hushed tones, their voices trembling with a mixture of fear and reverence. They tell tales of ancient rituals and the monstrous beings that dwell beneath the surface, creatures that have watched over the land for eons, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The mountain is not merely a geographical feature, it is a living entity, a keeper of secrets that have been buried for millennia. The atmosphere is thick with an unspoken dread, a feeling that something is watching, waiting, and perhaps even listening. The wind carries with it the faintest echoes of forgotten languages, and the ground beneath one's feet seems to pulse with an ancient rhythm. It is a place where the boundaries between the mundane and the cosmic blur, and where the very essence of the universe feels palpable yet terrifyingly distant. This is the setting for a tale that will delve into the depths of the unknown, a journey that will test the limits of sanity and the strength of the human spirit. As the stars begin to twinkle above, their cold light casting an eerie glow on the landscape, the stage is set for a confrontation with the unfathomable. The protagonist's obsession. In a quiet village nestled at the foot of the Forbidden Mountain, there lived a man named Elias Vaughn. Unlike the other villagers who spoke of the mountain in hushed tones and avoided its shadow whenever possible, Elias was drawn to it like a moth to flame. His fascination had begun in childhood, when he first heard the stories whispered by the elders, tales of an ancient presence that slumbered beneath the mountain's surface, waiting for the day when the veil of time would thin once more. At first, Elias had been merely curious, but as the years passed, that curiosity had deepened into an obsession. His family had once been respected members of the village, but over time their name had faded into obscurity. His grandfather, a scholar of obscure texts, had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only a collection of cryptic manuscripts and a lingering sense of unease. Elias had inherited both the books and the burden of his ancestors' fate, and he had spent years poring over the brittle pages, searching for answers to the questions that haunted him. The mountain had always been at the heart of these writings, a place of forbidden knowledge and cosmic horror. Despite the warnings of the villagers, Elias could not resist the pull of the mountain. He had walked its slopes many times, tracing the ancient paths carved into the stone, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing upon him. He had dreamed of the mountain in his sleep, of shapes that moved in the darkness and voices that spoke in languages he could not understand. The more he learned, the more he felt the presence of something watching him, something that had been waiting for him all along. Yet, despite the fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind, Elias could not turn away. The mountain called to him, and he had no choice but to answer. He had spent years searching for the truth, and now he was on the verge of uncovering the secret that had been buried for centuries. The villagers had long warned him that some knowledge was not meant for mortal minds, that to look too deeply into the abyss was to invite madness. But Elias was not afraid. He had come too far, and he would not stop now. The mountain had chosen him, and he would not refuse its call. The discovery of the forbidden text. One evening, as the last light of day bled into the horizon, Elias found himself wandering the forgotten ruins that lay at the base of the mountain. The village had long abandoned these crumbling remnants of an ancient civilization, their stones worn smooth by time and the relentless passage of the wind. Here, among the broken pillars and shattered mosaics, Elias had often searched for clues, fragments of a past that refused to be forgotten. But that night something different awaited him. As he stepped over a collapsed archway, his foot struck something solid beneath the loose gravel. He knelt and brushed away the dirt, revealing a slab of stone unlike any he had seen before. Its surface was covered in intricate carvings, symbols that twisted and coiled in impossible patterns, as though they had been drawn by an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. The markings pulsed faintly in the dim light, as if the stone itself was alive. Elias ran his fingers over the grooves, feeling a strange warmth radiating from within. He pried at the stone, and with a groan of ancient wood, a hidden compartment revealed itself. Inside, wrapped in brittle parchment and sealed with a resin that had hardened over the centuries, lay a single weathered tome. The cover was of unknown material, neither leather nor cloth, and it bore no title. As he opened it, a strange scent filled the air, something ancient, something that smelled of decay and the deep, unlighted places beneath the earth. The pages were filled with text written in an unknown script, the ink still dark despite the passage of time. At first, the symbols seemed to shift as he looked at them, as though they were alive, watching him. He tried to decipher them, but the language defied all known systems of writing. Yet, as he traced the lines with his eyes, something within him stirred, a feeling of recognition that he could not explain. Then, a whisper, soft at first, barely audible, rose from the pages. It was not a voice, but a presence, a sensation that pressed against his mind, urging him to read. He obeyed, and the words began to take shape in his thoughts, though they were not in any language he knew. They spoke of the mountain, of the things that lay beneath it, of the ancient ones who had once walked the earth and now slumbered in the depths. The text described a place beyond the reach of the sun, a place where time did not move as it did above. It spoke of a being that had come before the world was formed, a God that had watched as the stars were born and the first life took shape. And it spoke of the mountain, not as a mere rock, but as a prison, a place where the god had been bound, waiting for the day when the veil of time would thin once more. Elias felt his breath quicken, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always known that the mountain was more than it seemed, but now he understood the truth. It was not just a place of fear and mystery. It was a place of power, of something ancient and waiting. And as he closed the tome, he could not shake the feeling that he had just opened a door that was never meant to be opened. The descent into the forbidden depths. Elias stood at the base of the mountain, the ancient tome clutched tightly in his hands. The wind howled around him, carrying with it the faintest echoes of a language that had no name. He knew that time was slipping away, that the moment he had waited for, the moment that would change. Everything was at hand. With a final glance at the village where the lights of the homes flickered like distant stars, he turned and began his ascent. The path was treacherous, a narrow trail carved into the rock by hands long forgotten. The stones beneath his feet were slick with condensation, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something older, something that had not seen the light of day in an age. The deeper he climbed, the more the mountain seemed to shift around him, as if it were alive, watching, waiting. At times the trail disappeared entirely, forcing him to press on by instinct alone. He had no map, no guide, only the knowledge that the truth lay within the mountain, and he would not turn back. As he climbed higher, the light from the world above faded, swallowed by the ever-thickening mist that clung to the mountain's surface. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant screech of unseen creatures and the soft rustling of something moving in the darkness. He pressed on, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his limbs aching with the weight of his journey. The mountain was not merely a place, it was a test, and he was its subject. At last he reached a cavernous opening in the rock, its mouth yawning wide like the maw of some ancient beast. The air was colder here, and the scent of decay was stronger, as if the mountain itself had been waiting for him. He stepped inside, and the world beyond the entrance faded into darkness. The passage was narrow, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the scent of something that had been buried for centuries. He could hear his own breathing, the sound echoing in the confined space, and the weight of the mountain above him pressed down with an almost unbearable force. He had to push forward, even as his body screamed for him to stop. Then the passage widened, and he found himself standing before a great stone door, half buried in the earth. It was carved with the same strange symbols he had seen in the ancient tome, and as he reached out to touch it, the air around him seemed to shift. A whisper, not from the wind, but from something deeper, something that had been waiting for him, filled the space. He pushed against the door, and it groaned in protest before slowly giving way. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, and as he stepped forward, he felt the weight of the mountain pressing upon him as if the very earth was trying to pull him back. He had come too far to turn back now. With a final breath, he stepped into the unknown, the awakening of the forgotten. As Elias stepped beyond the threshold of the ancient door, a wave of cold, suffocating darkness enveloped him. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling as if the very air around him had turned to liquid. The passage beyond was impossibly vast, its walls stretching into an abyss that defied comprehension. The stone was slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and something far older, something that had not seen the light of day in an age. Then the darkness began to move. At first it was only a whisper, a shifting of shadows that did not belong to the flickering torchlight he had brought with him. The shadows coiled and twisted, forming shapes that were not of this world, figures that writhed and pulsed, their forms shifting between the familiar and the utterly alien. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he forced himself to move forward, his legs shaking with the weight of the unknown pressing upon him. And then he saw it. The entity was not a thing of flesh and bone, but something beyond human understanding. It was a mass of shifting, amorphous shapes, its form constantly changing, as though it were composed of the very fabric of the universe itself. It was not a being in the way that men and beasts were, but something older, something that had existed before the stars had burned and the world had been shaped. Its presence was not merely felt. It was felt in the marrow of his bones, in the very core of his being. It was watching him. The entity did not move in the way that living things did. It did not walk or crawl, nor did it possess any discernible limbs or face. Instead, it pulsed, a slow, rhythmic undulation that seemed to echo the very heartbeat of the universe. It was vast, immeasurable, and yet it was right before him, pressing against the limits of his perception. Its form was a shifting mass of darkness and light, of impossible geometry and impossible colors that had no name, that had never been seen by human eyes. Elias staggered back, his breath coming in short, panic gasps. The air around him was thick with something unseen, something that pressed against his mind like a weight that could not be lifted. He could feel it, the presence of the entity, not as a threat, but as something that had always been there, waiting. The entity did not speak in words, but in thoughts that did not belong to him. They were not words, but impressions, memories of a time before time, of a world that had been and was no more. He felt himself being pulled into the entity's presence, his mind unraveling, his senses slipping beyond the bounds of human comprehension. He was not merely seeing the entity, he was becoming part of it. Then the entity moved. It was not movement in the way that men moved, but a shifting of the very fabric of reality. The walls around him trembled, the air warped, and the darkness deepened. The entity was not merely watching him, it was testing him, drawing him into its embrace, into the abyss that had waited for him for so long. Elias fell to his knees, his mind reeling, his body trembling. He had come searching for the truth, for the knowledge that had been hidden for centuries, and now the truth was before him, vast and unrelenting, and he was no longer merely an observer. He was part of it now. The descent into madness. Elias's mind was unraveling, the very fabric of his thoughts fraying under the weight of the entity's presence. Air around him had thickened, pressing against his skin like a living thing, and the darkness was no longer empty. It was alive, pulsing with something ancient, something that had existed before the stars had burned and the world had been shaped. He tried to move, but his limbs felt as though they had been bound in chains of shadow, his body no longer his own. The entity was not merely watching him anymore. It was speaking to him, not in words, but in thoughts that did not belong to him. He felt himself being pulled deeper into its embrace, his mind slipping beyond the boundaries of human understanding. He saw things that should not be seen, vast, incomprehensible landscapes stretching beyond the limits of the universe, where time did not move as it did in the world above. The weight of the cosmos pressing upon him, the infinite vastness of existence, and in that moment he understood the terrible truth. He was not merely standing before the entity. He was standing before something that had existed, before the stars had been born, before the first breath of life had been drawn. His vision blurred, and the world around him twisted, shifting between the known and the unknowable. He saw himself standing in the depths of the mountain, but also in places that should not exist, places where the sun had never risen, where the sky was not a sky, but something else entirely. He saw himself as a child, as a man, as something else entirely, and in each moment he was not the same. The entity was not merely revealing the past. It was revealing the infinite, the endless cycle of creation and destruction, of being and unbeing. It was not merely witnessing the entity, he was becoming part of it. The entity was not a god in the ways that had ever burst the universe, that the entity was not a god in the way that men had worshipped gods. It was not a being that had always been. It was not bound by time, nor by the laws of the universe. It was the void itself, the endless abyss that had existed before the first light had ever burned. And now it was reaching for him, drawing him into its embrace, into the eternal nothingness beyond the limits of mortal comprehension. He tried to resist, to pull himself back from the abyss, but his body was no longer his own. His limbs moved of their own accord, his thoughts no longer his own. He could feel the entity's presence within him, a presence that was not malevolent, but indifferent. It did not seek to destroy him, nor to save him. It merely existed, and now he was part of that existence. The darkness deepened, and the entity's form shifted, becoming something that could not be named. It was no longer a mass of shifting shadows, but something more, something that defied all human understanding. It was not a god, nor a demon, nor a monster. It was something beyond all of those things, beyond all that could be named. It was the void, the abyss, the endless, unknowable expanse that had existed before the world had been made. And now Elias was part of it, the revelation of the entity. The entity was not merely a God. It was the very essence of the void, the unlighted abyss that had existed before the first star had burned. It was not a being in the way that men and beasts were, but something that had always been, something that had shaped the cosmos before time had ever taken its first breath. It was not a god that had been worshipped or feared. It was a force that had existed before the concept of worship or fear had ever taken root in the minds of men. It was the great and terrible unknown, the infinite expanse that had no beginning and no end. Elias, now no longer himself, felt the entity's presence within him, not as a possession, but as an extension of something far greater than any mortal mind could comprehend. He was not merely standing before the entity. He was part of it, his consciousness unraveling, merging with the vast and unknowable. He saw the entity not as a singular being, but as the embodiment of the universe's endless cycle of creation and destruction, of birth and oblivion. It was not a god that had been worshipped by ancient civilizations. It was a force that had shaped the cosmos before the first stars had ever burned, before the first life had ever taken form. He saw the entity's influence stretching beyond the mountain, beyond the world, beyond the limits of time itself. It had been there when the first light had ignited in the darkness, when the first breath of life had been drawn into the void. It had watched as the stars had burned and had died, as the planets had formed and had crumbled into dust. It had been present when the first civilizations had risen, and when they had fallen, their knowledge lost to the sands of time. It was not merely an ancient being. It was the force that had shaped the universe, the force that had watched as the cosmos had expanded and had collapsed, as the stars had been born and had been swallowed by the abyss. And now it had chosen him, not to destroy, not to rule, but to understand. He was not merely a witness to the entity's existence. He was a part of it, a vessel through which the entity's presence could be felt, a bridge between the mortal and the unknowable. The entity did not seek to consume him, nor to control him. It merely existed, and now he was part of that existence. He was no longer a man, no longer a seeker of knowledge. He was something else entirely, something that had always been, something that would never be forgotten. The entity was not a monster, nor was it a god. It was the great and terrible unknown, the force that had shaped the cosmos and would shape it again. And now it had chosen him. He was no longer merely a man who had come seeking the truth. He was the truth itself, the embodiment of the entity's presence, the voice of the abyss that had waited for him for so long. And as he stood before the entity, he understood that he would never be the same again. The final descent. Elias was no longer a man. He was something else entirely, something that had existed before the first breath of life had been drawn, before the first star had burned. The entity had taken him, and in doing so it had taken his name, his past, his very sense of self. He no longer remembered the village, the mountain, the books that had led him here. He did not remember the fear that had driven him forward, the obsession that had consumed him. He was nothing now, only a vessel for the entity, a whisper in the abyss. The darkness pressed in around him, thick and unrelenting, and he felt himself being pulled deeper into the void, his mind unraveling, his thoughts dissolving into the endless expanse of the entity's presence. He was not merely a witness to the entity's power. He was its voice, its will, its willful extension into the world that had once been his. He saw the world as the entity saw it, not as a place of life and death, but as a cycle of creation and destruction, of being and unbeing. He saw the stars as they had once been, as they would be again, as they would be forever. The entity did not speak in words, but in thoughts that did not belong to him. He felt himself being pulled into the entity's embrace, his mind slipping beyond the limits of human comprehension. He was not merely standing before the entity, he was becoming it. The entity had no need for him now, for it had already taken him, had already made him part of itself. He was no longer a man, no longer a seeker of knowledge. He was the entity itself, the force that had shaped the cosmos. Before time had ever begun, the force that would shape it again. And as the darkness deepened, as the void consumed him, he felt no fear, no resistance. He was no longer Elias Vaughn. He was something else entirely, something that had always been, something that would never be forgotten. The legacy of the abyss. The village remained untouched, its people unaware of the fate that had befallen Elias. The mountain, ever watchful, stood as it always had, its shadow stretching across the land like a silent sentinel. The wind howled through the narrow valleys, carrying with it the echoes of a time long past, of a presence that had once been and would be again. The villagers continued their lives, their stories passed down in hushed whispers, their fear of the mountain never fading. But something had changed. The mountain no longer felt the same. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive, as if the very fabric of reality had been disturbed. The stars above seemed to flicker with an unnatural light, and the night was no longer merely dark. It was something else, something that could not be named. The people of the village had no way of knowing what had transpired beyond their borders, but they could feel it, the weight of something ancient pressing upon them, the knowledge that they were not alone in the world. And in the depths of the mountain, where the darkness had swallowed Elias Vaughn, the entity remained. It was not merely waiting, it was watching, waiting for the day when the veil of time would thin once more. The cycle had not ended, it had only begun. Again. The mountain had not been disturbed, but it had been changed, and the knowledge that had once been buried was now something else, something that would not be forgotten. The entity would return. It always did. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it. The Island of Forgotten Whispers. The island loomed on the horizon, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky. Mist curled around its cliffs like the breath of something ancient and unseen, and the air carried the scent of salt and decay. Dr. Evelyn Hart stepped off the boat, her boots sinking slightly into the damp sand as the wind howled through the trees. The island had no name in any known record, only a vague reference in a forgotten journal she had once stumbled upon in a dusty archive. It was a place that should not exist, yet here it was, waiting. The ruins stretched before her, half buried beneath tangled roots and creeping vines. Towering stone pillars, worn smooth by time, stood like silent sentinels, their surfaces etched with symbols that had no known origin. Some of the carvings were faint, as if the wind had tried to erase them, while others remained sharp and deliberate, their meaning just out of reach. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the island itself was holding its breath. Evelyn adjusted the straps of her satchel and took a cautious step forward. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, littered with broken stone and the remnants of something long abandoned. She had spent years chasing the echoes of forgotten civilizations, but nothing had prepared her for this. This place was different. It was not merely ancient, it was something else, something that had been waiting. As she moved deeper into the ruins, the shadows lengthened, stretching unnaturally across the ground. The wind died, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against her ears. She could not shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something unseen was aware of her presence. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth that had drawn her here. Then, from the darkness beyond the ruins, something stirred. A flicker of movement, too fast to be anything natural. Evelyn froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She was not alone, and whatever was watching her was not meant to be found. The scholar's obsession. The scholar's obsession. Dr. Evelyn Hart had always been drawn to the unknown, to the whispers of history that had been lost to time. Her career as an archaeologist and linguist had been built on the pursuit of forgotten civilizations, the unearthing of secrets buried beneath the earth. But nothing had ever consumed her like this place. The island had appeared in the margins of an obscure journal, its existence hinted at in a passage that had no clear origin. The words had been written in a language she had never seen before, yet something about them had called to her, as though they had been waiting for her to find them. She had spent years tracing the journal's origins, following a trail of cryptic references and half-forgotten legends. It had led her to a forgotten monastery in the mountains of southern Europe, where an aging monk had reluctantly shared the story of the island. He had spoken of it in hushed tones, as though even the mention of its name could summon something that should not be disturbed. The monk had warned her that those who had sought the island had never returned. The Evelyn had not. Been deterred. She had been too close to the truth to turn away now. The journal itself had been a relic of a bygone era, its pages brittle with age, its ink faded but still legible. The symbols that had once been indecipherable now seemed to pulse with meaning, as though they had been waiting for her to understand them. She had spent countless nights poring over its pages, tracing the strange script with her fingers, searching for a pattern, a connection. And then, one night, she had found it. A passage that described an entity that had once walked the earth, an ancient being that had been worshipped and feared in equal measure. The text had been fragmented, but one phrase had stood out. The one who reads these words will awaken what was never meant to be. Found. The words had haunted her ever since. She had dismissed them at first, attributing them to the fevered ramblings of a long-dead scribe. But the more she studied the journal, the more she felt the weight of its meaning pressing against her mind. It was not just a record of the past, it was a warning. And she had come here to find out what it meant. Now, standing in the ruins of the island, she felt the weight of that warning pressing against her. The air was thick with the scent of something ancient, something that had been buried for centuries. The symbols carved into the stone seemed to shift in the dim light, as though they were alive, watching her. She could not shake the feeling that she was standing on the threshold of something far greater than she had ever imagined. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the fear that coiled in her chest, she had no intention of turning back. The island had called her, and she would not leave until she uncovered the truth. The awakening of the forgotten, Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps as she pressed forward, her boots crunching against the brittle remains of what had once been a grand structure. The ruins stretched before her in a labyrinth of crumbling archways and shattered pillars, each one seemingly untouched by time. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and something else. Something ancient, something that had not been disturbed for centuries. She ran her fingers along the carvings on the nearest pillar, tracing the intricate symbols that had once been a language of a forgotten civilization. They were not just markings, they were a message, a warning, or perhaps a summoning. She had spent years deciphering the journal's cryptic passages, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of standing here in the heart of the ruins. The symbols on the stone were deeper than she had ever imagined, as though they had been etched not by human hands, but by something far older, something that had shaped the very fabric of the world. The wind had died, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against her ears, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the ground, as if they were watching her, waiting. Then a flicker of movement. At first she thought it was her own reflection, a trick of the dim light filtering through the overgrown trees. But as she turned, the air around her seemed to shift, thickening like a living thing. A low, resonant hum filled the space between her and the darkness beyond the ruins, a sound that vibrated in her bones. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow. She was not alone. From the depths of the ruins something stirred. The shadows coalesced, forming a shape that was neither human nor beast, but something in between. It was massive, its form shifting between the solidity of stone and the fluidity of smoke. Its presence was overwhelming, pressing against her like a weight that could not be lifted. Evelyn took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She had read about entities that defied human understanding, that existed beyond the limits of time and space, but she had never imagined encountering one in the flesh. The entity did not move forward. It did not need to. Its presence alone was enough to make the air around it tremble. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were dark voids that seemed to pull at the edges of her vision, as though they were not looking at her, but through her, into the very core of her being. She felt a coldness seep into her bones, a sensation that was not merely physical, but something deeper, something that reached into the marrow of her soul. And then a voice. It was not spoken, but felt, a whisper that slithered through her mind, threading itself into her thoughts. It was not in any language she knew, yet she understood it perfectly. "You have come at last." Evelyn's knees buckled, and she stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The entity did not move, but she could feel its gaze upon her, as if it was testing her, waiting to see if she would break. She had spent years chasing the echoes of the past, but now, standing in the presence of something that had existed before the world had been formed, she felt the weight of her own insignificance. The entity was not just ancient, it was eternal, and it had been waiting for her. The awakening of the forgotten. The entity did not move, but the world around Evelyn shifted. The ruins trembled, dust and debris falling from the crumbling structures as though the very stones were reacting to its presence. The air thickened, pressing against her skin like an unseen force, and the shadows that had once been mere darkness now writhed and pulsed as though they were alive. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling, with a fear that was not merely of the entity before her, but of something deeper, something that had been buried for centuries and was now rising once more. The entity's form was not fixed. It was a shifting mass of darkness and light, its edges blurring as though it existed between the physical and the metaphysical. At times it seemed to be composed of stone, its surface rough and jagged, as though it had been carved from the very bones of the earth. At other moments it was fluid, like ink spilling across the void, its shape stretching and reforming with each passing second. It was not a thing of flesh and bone, but something far older, something that had existed before her. First stars had burned in the sky. And then the voice returned. "You have come at last." The words were not spoken, but felt, pressing into her mind like a weight that could not be lifted. Evelyn's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her hands clawing at the stone beneath her. The entity did not move, but she could feel its presence pressing against her, as though it was not merely watching her, but consuming her, peeling away the layers of her mind to reveal the raw, unfiltered truth of her existence. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The entity's presence was suffocating, an overwhelming force that threatened to crush her entirely. She could feel her thoughts unraveling, her mind slipping into something vast and unknowable. It was not just fear that gripped her. It was the realization that she was not merely standing in the presence of an ancient being, but that she was being consumed by it. The entity's form shifted again, its shape becoming more defined, more tangible. It was no longer just a presence. It was something that had once walked the earth, something that had been worshipped and feared in equal measure. The symbols on the stone around her pulsed with a strange energy, as though they were reacting to the entity's awakening. She could feel the weight of history pressing against her, the weight of something that had been buried for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise once more. And then the entity spoke again. "You have come. At two." The words were not just a message, they were a command. A summons. Evelyn could feel the entity's presence pressing against her, demanding something from her, something she did not yet understand. She tried to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped, not by chains or walls, but by the sheer weight of the entity's presence. The ruins around her trembled, and the ground beneath her feet cracked as though the island itself was awakening. The shadows deepened, stretching toward her, wrapping around her like a shroud. The entity was no longer just a presence. It was becoming something more, something that had been waiting for her, for this moment. And as the entity's form solidified, as its presence grew stronger, Evelyn realized with a sickening certainty that she was not merely an observer in this moment. She was a part of it. The entity was no longer just a presence. It was Mobir, wrapping around her like a shroud. Had been waiting for her, and now it was time for her to answer. The descent into madness. Evelyn's mind was unraveling force. It was a consuming tide, pulling her deeper into the abyss of its existence. The air around her was thick with something unnameable, a pressure that pressed against her skull, forcing her thoughts into a chaotic whirlwind. She could feel her own mind slipping away, her thoughts no longer her own, but something else, something vast and unknowable. She tried to scream again, but her throat was dry, her voice stolen by the entity's influence. Her body trembled, her limbs shaking as though she were caught in a storm that no human could withstand. The ruins around her groaned, the stone beneath her feet vibrating with an energy. That was not natural, not of this world. She could feel the ground shifting, as though the island itself was awakening, responding to the entity's presence. Then the visions began. At first they were fragmented shadows flickering at the edges of her vision, whispers curling through the air like smoke. But soon they became more vivid, more real. She saw herself standing in a different place, a place that was not the ruins, but something far older, far more ancient. The sky was a deep, inky black, the stars not shining but burning with an unnatural light. The ground was not stone, but something else, something that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, as though the very earth was alive. And then the entity was there again. It was not just a presence now, but something tangible, something that had taken form. It stood before her, its shape shifting between the solidity of stone and the fluidity of smoke. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were deep voids that seemed to pull at the edges of her vision, as though they were not looking at her, but through her, into the very core of her being. She could feel its gaze pressing against her, as though it was peeling away the layers of her mind, revealing the raw, unfiltered truth of her existence. She tried to move, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped, not by chains or walls, but by the sheer weight of the entity's presence. She could feel it pressing against her, demanding something from her, something she did not yet understand. The entity was not merely watching her. It was testing her, waiting to see if she would break. And then the whispers returned. They were not spoken, but felt, threading themselves into her thoughts, whispering secrets that had been buried for centuries. They spoke of the journal, of the symbols she had spent years deciphering, of the warnings that had been written in a language she had never known. They spoke of the entity itself, of the power it held, of the knowledge that had been lost to time. And they spoke of her, of the role she had played in its awakening. She tried to resist, to push the whispers away, but they were too deep, too insidious. They were not just voices. They were a presence, a force that had been waiting for her, for this moment. And then the visions changed again. She saw herself, standing in the ruins, but this time the entity was not watching her. It was speaking to her, its voice a whisper that slithered through her mind. "You have come at last!" The words echoed in her thoughts, pressing against her, demanding something from her. She did not know what it wanted. She did not know what she was meant to do. All she knew was that the entity was not merely a presence. It was a force, something that had existed before the world had been formed, something that had been waiting for her. And now it was time for her to answer. The confrontation with the forgotten. The entity's form solidified, its presence pressing against Evelyn with an overwhelming force that threatened to consume her entirely. The air around her was thick with an unnatural energy, a pressure that made her lungs burn and her mind reel. She could feel the weight of the entity's gaze upon her, as though it was peering into the very core of her being, searching for something she did not yet understand. The ruins trembled, the stone beneath her feet vibrating with a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the entity itself. The shadows that had once been mere darkness now writhed and pulsed, stretching toward her like tendrils of ink spilling across the void. She could feel them wrapping around her, pressing against her skin, as though they were not just shadows, but something far more tangible, something that had been waiting for her. And then the entity spoke again. "You have come at last." The words were not spoken, but felt, pressing into her mind like a weight that could not be lifted. Evelyn's knees buckled, and she stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The entity did not move, but she could feel its presence pressing against her, as if it was not merely watching her, but consuming her, peeling away the layers of her mind to reveal the raw, unfiltered truth of her existence. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The entity's presence was suffocating, an overwhelming force that threatened to crush her entirely. She could feel her thoughts unraveling, her mind slipping into something vast and unknowable. It was not just fear that gripped her. It was the realization that she was not merely standing in the presence of an ancient being, but that she was being consumed by it. The entity's form shifted. Again, its shape becoming more defined, more tangible. It was no longer just a presence. It was something that had once walked the earth, something that had been worshipped and feared in equal measure. The symbols on the stone around her pulsed with a strange energy, as though they were reacting to the entity's awakening. She could feel the weight of history pressing against her, the weight of something that had been buried for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise once more. And then the entity spoke again. "You have come at last!" The words were not just a message. They were a command, a summons. Evelyn could feel the entity's presence pressing against her, demanding something from her, something she did not yet understand. She tried to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped, not by chains or walls, but by the sheer weight of the entity's presence. The ruins around her trembled, and the ground beneath her feet cracked as though the island itself was awakening. The shadows deepened, stretching toward her, wrapping around her like a shroud. The entity was no longer just a presence. It was becoming something more, something that had been waiting for her, for this moment. And as the entity's form solidified, as its presence grew stronger, Evelyn realized with a sickening certainty that she was not merely an observer in this moment. She was a part of it. The entity had been waiting for her, and now it was time for her to answer. The final descent. Evelyn's body was no longer her own. The entity's presence had consumed her, its influence seeping into every fiber of her being, unraveling her thoughts, her identity, her very essence. She was no longer a scholar, no longer a seeker of knowledge, but something else, something that had been waiting for this moment, for this confrontation. The ruins around her pulsed with an energy that was not of this world, a force that had been buried for centuries and was now rising once more. The entity's form was no longer shifting, no longer fluid. It had solidified, its shape taking on a form that was both ancient and unfathomable. It was not human, not beast, but something beyond comprehension, something that had existed before the first stars had burned in the sky. The air around it was thick with the weight of history, the weight of something that had been forgotten and now remembered. And then, the journal. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she reached for it, her body moving without her consent. The journal had been her key, her guide, the thing that had led her here. But now, it was something else. It was the thing that had awakened the entity, the thing that had bound them together. The pages fluttered in the unnatural wind, the ink bleeding as though the words themselves were alive, shifting, changing, revealing secrets that had been hidden for centuries. She could feel the entity's presence pressing against her, demanding something from her, something she did not yet understand. The journal was no longer just a book. It was a vessel, a conduit between her and the entity, a bridge between the past and the present. And now it was time for her to complete the ritual. The ruins trembled as the entity's form expanded, its presence growing stronger, more overwhelming. The shadows deepened, stretching toward her, wrapping around her like a shroud. The ground beneath her feet cracked, and the air grew thick with an energy that was not natural, not of this world. She could feel the weight of the entity's gaze upon her, as though it was peering into the very core of her being, searching for something she did not yet know. And then, the final words. The journal's pages fluttered, the ink shifting, the words forming into something that had never been written before. It was a message, a command, a final act that would bind her to the entity forever. She could feel the words pressing against her mind, demanding something from her, something she did not yet understand. And then the entity spoke again. "You have come at last." The words echoed in her mind, pressing against her, demanding something from her. She could feel the entity's presence pressing against her, demanding something from her, something she did not yet know. And then she understood. She was not merely an observer in this moment. She was a part of it. The entity had been waiting for her, and now it was time for her to answer. The echoes of the forgotten. As the final words of the journal settled into the air, the ruins around Evelyn pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, as though the very earth was alive. The entity's form no longer shifted, no longer writhed with the fluidity of smoke and shadow. It had become something else, something vast, something eternal. And she, Evelyn Hart, was no longer a scholar, no longer a seeker of knowledge. She was something else entirely. The journal's pages fluttered one last time, the ink bleeding into the air, dissolving into the wind that had long been absent from this place. The symbols on the stone around her pulsed with a final, resounding energy, as though they were acknowledging the ritual's completion. The ruins trembled, the ground beneath her feet cracking, as the weight of the entity's presence grew heavier. She could feel it pressing against her, not as a force of destruction, but as something that had always been waiting for this moment. And then the entity spoke one final time. "You have come at last, Nas." The words echoed in her mind, not as a command, but as a truth. She had come, not just to uncover the past, but to become a part of it. The journal had been the key, the vessel that had bound her to the entity, the thing that had allowed her to understand what had been waiting for her all along. And now, as the ruins trembled and the shadows deepened, she realized that she would never leave this place. The entity had not consumed her in the way she had feared. It had not taken her life, had not destroyed her mind. It had simply made her a part of something greater. The knowledge she had sought, the secrets that had been buried for centuries, had not been lost to time. They had been waiting for her, for this moment. And now they would remain with her forever. As the final echoes of the ritual faded into the silence of the ruins, Evelyn stood at the threshold of something beyond human comprehension. She was no longer a scholar, no longer a seeker of forgotten truths. She was something else now, something eternal, something that would never be forgotten. And as the wind returned, carrying with it the whispers of the past, the ruins stood in eerie stillness, waiting for the next one to come. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.